Okay, onward. So I'm going to be using my notes in the next video or two videos. We'll see where it seems like it makes sense to separate the two. I'm going to be using my notes a little bit more because, at least for the specific stuff about Mesoamerica, it's not all in my mind in the same way that some of these more conceptual things are. I need to refer to dates and places and things like that, none of which you need to remember or memorize, but if it's orienting for you all, I can provide a timeline and terms and things like that so that you can have them visually. But before I talk specifically about Mesoamerica, there are a couple more general things that I want to talk to you about, and those are really what I want to suggest is that there are two characteristics that have to do with the natural landscape of this large place that we call Latin America now, that fundamentally shaped social organization and worldview for people who live there. And again, we are trying to make sense of something so vast. So we're looking for commonalities. We're looking for things that we can talk about in general. This does not mean that one should talk about this region as monolithic in any way. These are just things that did shape. These are things that when you look at this land area, these are things about the geography that are specific and special, not maybe unique in the whole world, but are particular enough to have shaped political formation and cosmology for Latin America. So the area that we call Latin America is a vast area of incredible diversity in terms of physical features and climate. I mean, some of the coldest temps and some of the hottest temps and all the different kinds of ecological possibilities and niches really do, and environments really do exist in this region. But there are two important characteristics that define this area really geographically and shape the way that people understood the cosmos related to the natural world around them. And these characteristics I want to suggest are isolation and variation. So by isolation, what I'm not talking about isolation from the rest of the world. That was also to a certain degree true, at least from the perspective of Europeans, but that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking now about something that shaped political organization prior to European arrival on this vastly diverse place and physical terrain. What I mean by isolation is to talk about a kind of internal isolation that repeats itself or at the time, prior to when we have the kinds of transportation that we do now. Latin America was made up of many enclosed and distinct regions geographically. So what I mean by that are things like valleys surrounded by mountains that were really hard to get out of, or jungles really close to the ocean. What's specific about this is that these regions contained within them a diversity of resources and complementary ecological zones that made up, a self-sufficient regions. It doesn't mean that there weren't parts of Latin America that weren't very inhabitable, and there were also parts of Latin America where people traveled between seasonally one region and another. But to an enormous degree, we have lots and lots of places that were self-sufficient in terms of the various kinds of natural resources one could encounter. And at the same time, it was also relatively difficult to travel outside of these regions. People certainly did travel outside of these regions, and we have histories of long distance trade going throughout the Americas for as long as there were people there. But those were, really large undertakings. And so, there was this sense that the known world was contained within a particular region. So I'm going to say more about that later, but that's what I mean by isolation, is that there were these self-contained regions where people lived, and communities, not just small communities, but large, multiple communities that developed into small states, et cetera, but that there was a kind of known world. We the people live here, we have everything we need here. It's pretty difficult to get outside of that ring of mountains, or it's pretty difficult to travel beyond the jungle. It's pretty difficult, can't go beyond the sea. There's a sort of defined region that defines our world, if you are the people living there. And then you do go beyond it, and you do have communication with other communities and with long distance trade, but that's quite of an endeavor. The known world that you exist in, which might contain multiple political entities, lots of different communities or whatever, but it's regional, that is very distinct. And then variation refers to the incredible diversity of climates and geographical regions. So you have mountains and oceans and rainforests, often in close proximity to each other, so that within 30 or 40 miles, you could go from sea level to 22,000 feet in altitude and have mountain valleys, tropical coastal zones, temperate areas, deserts, and jungles, all within, fairly close proximity to each other. So you've got a lot going on. Those are two characteristics that really came to define the development of political structures and also worldviews. So these features meant that within the distinct and enclosed geographical regions, you have thousands of small, well-ordered communities that would develop in a series of closely spaced ecological niches where different kinds of production could take place, complementary kinds of production. And then these communities would be connected by trading centers that developed for the exchange of goods and services. And so this then led to the development of scores of small states within each of these regions. So you could have, small communities that lived in very different kinds of ecological places, but were fairly easy to get to, and they developed complementary production or complementary, resource harvesting, etc. And then there would be a central area that would develop for trading, and all within that region that was sort of the known world, outside of which was hard to get to. And so that developed, that led to, even though there's like thousands of these little communities, each maybe that had their own language, or at least different dialect, they existed in different ecological environments. They produced different kinds of things. So they had, a lot of differences, but they also were within this larger region. And because of their access to different resources, were able to trade in a way that was sustaining for everybody. And so frequently these kinds of trading centers and these kinds of relationships gave rise to these small states. And that was really the most enduring kind of political structure for, the whole of the history of what we call Latin America prior to when Europeans arrived. The enormous empires of the Aztec Empire and the Inca and some others, which we'll talk about, did exist, but they tended to rise and fall, whereas these small states actually lasted for much longer. So this kind of political and social development encouraged complementary and connected religious practices and cultural practices and worldviews within the regions, but also nurtured really local ones as well. So individual communities might have their own relationship to nature and to the concept of the divine, as we might think about it, and their own practices related to the resources that they cultivated that were also symbolic and what we would call religious in nature, and their own language to talk about it and their own particular practices. So these local spiritual practices, cultural practices, political organizations and practices coexisted with those related to the larger state. And that's significant. There was always a sense that there were different levels of what we might call truths or allegiance to symbolic systems and to leadership and to local autonomy and et cetera, linked by economic practices and linked by religious practices, what we might call religious practices. So on a local level, intellectual leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, or specialists might hold specific knowledge related to community histories, community production practices, local sacred places that were specific to the geography, et cetera. These might be connected to particular natural features in the nearby land, a specific cave or stream or rock or tree, talking about sort of symbolic, what we might call sacred practices. While on the state level, these same kind of specialists might be political authority figures that would create, would oversee the creation of large material structures, human-made structures for larger ceremonies, larger political and religious ceremonies, etc. And here we have the development of temples and platforms for public kinds of rituals, be they what we would think of as religious or civic, probably a mixture of both because the division didn't really make sense. So, those are some of the things that we know the most about, pyramids and the platforms, etc. But those aren't the only thing going on in these regions at all. And allegiance to a state religion or a state political structure and participation in these larger rituals was sometimes imposed by the state authority on the smaller communities, but not in a way that replaced local traditions, not in a way that required local specialists to give up their knowledge or people to abandon those particular ways of understanding the world around them. Again, this becomes really important when Europeans arrive and demand something quite different than this sort of coexistence. And this tendency towards coexistence between the local and the larger with the small states was even true when very large states developed that incorporated several regions. And that's what we're talking about with the empires. The Mayan Empire, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, others that I'll mention in a little bit too. But there were, over time, these distinct regions that were small states, often through trade relationships and relationships that forged by warfare and demands of tribute, etc. These much larger states, or what we might call empires, might develop where they incorporated several of these regions. But even when that was the case and allegiance to these much larger forms of authority were imposed and demanded, again, the local language and symbols and practices and ways of understanding their world, particularly in relationship to what we might call the sacred, were not forbidden. They were generally not the larger state religion, if you want to call it that, did not replace the local. The Aztecs and the Inca were only the two most recent and well-known of these very large states, but because they were functioning when Europeans arrived, that's what we tend to think of them as the dominant empires in the region, but that's really not the case. They were just really the most recent. And these kinds of very large states tended to be relatively unstable in comparison to the small states. And so these sorts of empires had been rising and falling from, for a very, very long time in this region. So large states tended to be relatively unstable compared to the smaller states that they incorporated into their empires. But as they rose and fell, they also tended to build on the traditions, literally on the cities, on the physical structures, but also on the religious symbols and ideas and figures. The winged serpent being one of the most important ones, Quetzalcoatl. We will talk about that. Again, this is Mesoamerica, but it was also true in other places as well. Built on the traditions that had come before them. So we can see continuity across thousands of years in certain symbols and certain images, certain practices and concepts within the regions that then gave rise to these large states. This is true for both Mesoamerica and the Andes, but it's strikingly true for Mesoamerica. And part of what defines Mesoamerica as a region, according to scholars who do this kind of defining, is the existence of certain common practices and symbols. So, for example, sacred ball courts is something that you find all across Mesoamerica, but not so much outside of Mesoamerica. The image of the jaguar as a way of envisioning divinity. Rain gods called either Chak or Tlaloc, depending on the region, but similarities often in the physical representation of these rain gods. And then the very long history of Quetzalcoatl, who is the winged serpent, who I'll talk more about. All of these things existed in the area that we call Mesoamerica from at least 1200 BC onward. And we'll talk more about some of these specifics in a bit. But nonetheless, this large-scale continuity coexisted with local traditions and beliefs. And I want you to keep this in mind when I get into some of the more specifics of the history of Mesoamerica, because we're going to focus on the legacy of these large states. But that's only because we know most about this legacy, because of the impact that it had on the people that came to be known as the Aztecs, but also because this is what was best historically preserved. But, anthropologists in particular have shown us that there is a remarkably strong continuity of much more local, even household level practices and concepts within small communities. We see archaeological evidence of things that are still going on today, dating as far back as this earlier time period, 1200 BC, where we see the rise of these big symbols like Quetzalcoatl. In other words, we're going to look at the rise and fall of these big states, but I want you to remember that there's a ton of local practices that we're not really talking about and that are really diverse and that may or may not have had much to do with some of these big symbols like Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl and some of the others have become uniting images for Indigenous communities today, at least from the perspective of a kind of pan-Indigenous revival, which has existed at least since the 1970s, and anti-colonial philosophy and things like that. They've become extremely important, but in fact they were imperial impositions at the time from the perspective of these smaller communities in the smaller states. So just want you to keep that in mind as we go through and talk about what we can talk about most clearly, which is really the legacy of these large states. So I went into a little bit of specifics about Mesoamerica, but I want to back up just a second and talk about a kind of cultural consequence or implication or ramification of that geographical feature of isolation and variation. And so what that is a very common and important view of the universe in pre-colonial Latin America, which is to understand the place that one is from as the center and origin of the universe. This is something you see over and over again throughout Mesoamerica, but not just Mesoamerica. This is actually larger, throughout the region that we now call Latin America. You find that the origin stories and the histories of humans in all of these different enclosed, distinct regions uses a word for themselves, the name of the people that are from that region, which simply means the people, and talks about their region as the birthplace of the whole universe, and talks about everything that exists outside of this enclosed region as less formed and therefore dangerous. So the order and disorder dualism repeats over and over again, mapped onto this notion of what is ordered, what is more fully formed, what is older, is what is closer to the origin, and what is closer to the origin is the known universe that we exist in, that one exists in. So again, this relates to internal isolation. So the existence of these distinct and enclosed geographical regions, particularly those surrounded by mountains, led many cultures and communities to believe that humans and the world that they lived in had originated in the place that they call home, and that everything that lay outside of this sacred protective ring of mountains surrounding them was unknown, dangerous, and somehow less fully formed. So a key idea in pre-colonial Latin America was a tension between order and disorder. And as I've mentioned before, in these regions, the place of order was thought to lie within the protective ring of mountains or within this known region, and the place of disorder outside of it. I'm going to pause for 1 second. Okay, I'm going to say more about that notion later in another video where I'm going to talk about the North and the waves of immigrants that among whom were the Mexica people, who were one of the primary political forces of the Aztec Empire. And I'm going to talk more about how that idea played out. But what I want to just clarify before I end this video and then move on to the video that is going to talk more in detail about the long history of Mesoamerica, is to say that this doesn't mean that people didn't actually know about other regions, and nor does it mean that people didn't know that those people over there talked about themselves that same way, because there did develop lingua francas, did develop languages that people could communicate with each other through for the purposes of trade, etc. So I'm not suggesting that people weren't aware of the world outside of these protective rings, but it was really difficult to get outside of it, of these particular regions. And there was a sense of, a repeating sense in all of these places of home as being the origin of the universe. So I'm fascinated by how that, as these large empires rose and fell, how that those ideas interacted with each other, like the intellectual specialists, how they thought about and read and understood, the forms of representation that people had. I pause right there because, as you may know, there wasn't writing in most of these places in the alphabetic way that we think of writing today, but there were forms of representation, some of them pictorial, some of them symbolic, some of them material, some of them a mixture of these things. But there were traditions of storytelling that used these physical, either artifacts, either physical things. Sometimes in the Andes, they used ropes. In Mesoamerica, in various places, there were books. There were these things that we now call codices, but they were books, printed material that, you know, weren't exactly pictographs and weren't exactly alphabetic, but were something in between, because there are what we now call glyphs that actually represent sounds, so particular parts of a syllable. So it really would, these glyphs together really would make up words. In other instances, an image would represent something like what the image depicted. So that's more like a pictograph. The other is more alphabetical, and we call them glyphs. So there were paintings, physical documentation that had a particular relationship with storytelling, with oral traditions and performative traditions, etc., that documented stories and that passed on stories. And what we don't know, at least to my knowledge, unless somebody's written about this recently, which may be the case, but I don't know of it yet, we don't know how the specialists who manage these kinds of systems of representation, we don't know how they interacted with each other or if they interacted with each other. So I'm very curious about that. So one of the mysteries for me always is, how do people think about this notion of being at the center of the universe and having the origin of the universe be you, when you know that that's the case for some other people over there? So how much did they know? You know, that's one of those questions. And so these large states that we will now move on to talking about did provide continuity, did provide symbols that repeated over and over again, that were, you know, that stretched for a very, very long period of time, but also an enormous geography. And so was this sort of some of the ways that people understood themselves in relationship to those other communities? This is a mystery and we don't really know. I'll see you in the next one.